Hi everyone. My name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching.
In this video, we will look into the main element of a so-called Ukraine support loan, which is an unprecedented financial aid accorded by the European Union and Ukraine in support of Ukraine in its war against Russia. And the reason why we're looking into this instrument within our series Sanctions 360 is that arguably this type of financial aid is just another form of sanctions. It's inherently linked to Russian assets within the European Union and the overall EU policy towards Russia. Given its unprecedented scale in the 21st century for the European Union, and even viewed in historical perspective against such forms of multilateral aid as the Marshall Plan or even Lend-Lease, it's quite a noteworthy feature, and it's certainly deserving a separate presentation. We will look today into the following points. We'll discuss the key elements of this instrument and whether it's appropriate to call it a loan, whether it's more appropriate to call it a subsidy, a grant, international support, aid. We will look into the financial conditions, and then we would finalize our presentation by looking into the main element of any type of international aid, namely the reform element, which this aid tries to introduce, as well as the procurement element for the parties providing the aid, which is always an essential element of this type of financing. So as to the legal framework, it is set by two legislative acts at the level of the European Union and Ukraine. In the European Union, it's a regulation 467 adopted this year, 2026, which is the legal framework for the loan. And then in Ukraine, it's a national law passed by the Ukrainian parliament, which ratified the international agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, setting out the provisions of the law. Having said this, these are domestic acts of both Ukraine and the European Union. And in domestic acts, they certainly don't create bilateral obligations between the two parties. And it is the loan agreement itself, signed between the European Commission, the Ministry of Finance of Ukraine, and the Ukraine National Bank, as the agent for the Ministry of Finance representing Ukraine, which is a bilateral document and which sets binding conditions for advancing this type of financing, and which is binding in both countries. So it is this document which is of primary interest for us, and it's regrettable from that perspective that this document is not widely publicized, at least within the European Union. I personally, for example, had to take the Ukrainian version of the loan ratified by the Ukrainian parliament. And then an additional document is Memorandum of Understanding, which sets out the macroeconomic conditions for macroeconomic support. The last preliminary comment is that the Ukraine support loan is not the only means of financial assistance provided by the European Union to Ukraine, but by far the most important one. So let's look at the main terms of the loan or aid. We will decide later in this presentation what would be the appropriate term for this instrument. Its principal amount set at 19 billion euros. And to give a perspective to this figure, compared to the Ukrainian GDP, it's almost half of the GDP if converted into euros. The loan is noteworthy not only compared to the national GDP, but also if put in perspective with, for example, the Marshall Plan, which was the reconstruction plan for Europe, and which, if adjusted for inflation, was in the region of 150, 170 billion euros. Given that the financing is provided for 2 years, 2026 and 2027, that's quite a remarkable amount. Another important feature of the instrument is that it's available in cash for drawdown, and it's then for the borrower, Ukraine, to decide how to use this cash within the parameters of the loan. That's important and very advantageous for the borrower because typically international support aid will be provided in the forms of technologies or services, for example, military equipment, military training services, rather than cash. As the loan is provided for 2 years, the exact allocation of the loan is to be decided in the so-called Ukrainian financing strategy, which is provided by Ukraine and reviewed by the European Union. And it is the same strategy which sets the allocation of the loan between its two main purposes. The first purpose is to provide budget support for Ukraine. So in essence, there are certainly, given the war in the country, not sufficient revenues from taxes, and there is not enough money to build and rebuild infrastructure, to pay salaries, to pay pensions, to provide for the education and healthcare for the Ukrainian people. That's understandable. So there is the budgetary gap between the spendings and the tax collections. And this gap is financed in part by this instrument. And that's 1/3 of the total amount, approximately 30 billion euros. And then the main part of 60 billion euros is actually the defense spending of Ukraine. The allocation is set in the Ukrainian financing strategy, as I mentioned, and it's already set for this year, 2026, where approximately 17 billion euros is to be allocated towards budget spendings, and the remaining part towards the acquisition of defense items. There was much debate about how the loan would be financed, where the cash will come from. I would not repeat that debate, which was very publicized in media. In essence, the discussion was whether Russian frozen assets, which are currently owed to the Russian central bank and are frozen by a Belgian bank, Euroclear, in the amount of approximately 210 billion euros, should be used for the purpose of financing this loan. Eventually, the position was that that would be too much of an escalation, which is likely to trigger the nationalization of the European businesses in Russia, which value by far exceeds the value of these assets and is in the region of €1 trillion. So it was decided that eventually the European Commission will finance the loan in the typical financing means by way of capital markets, bank loans. So they would just borrow by way of issuing bonds or obtaining a loan from the financial institutions, more likely bonds, as they typically do. And then certainly the bonds will be serviced both in terms of principal amount and any coupon which is payable on them from the membership fees of the EU member states. Given quite substantial disagreement at the time over this instrument, 3 countries eventually opted out of this financing mechanism, which means that they will not contribute to the EU budget to service these loans. This is probably the most important element to decide how we would classify this instrument, whether it's really a loan or a subsidy. A loan is typically repayable and it has a fixed term of repayment, and it typically carries interest, representing the cost of funding and the credit risk which the lender takes on the borrower. Certainly in case of Ukraine, given its current state of affairs, neither one nor the other is really workable. It's difficult to say when and if Ukraine would be able to repay any amounts of this scale, and certainly the credit rating does not allow to borrow funds at any reasonable cost. Accordingly, the structure of the loan agreement is that it's not repayable as a general matter, and it's repayable only if and when Ukraine receives from Russia cash, which represents the reparation for the war which Russia leads in Ukraine. Same approaches to the interest. Ukraine is entitled for a subsidy, and although the relevant provisions are drafted in entitlement, it's quite clear that Ukraine will indeed receive the subsidy, especially given that the loan is open-ended and it's not clear when it will be repaid. Even the structure as it is, the reparation proceeds, is drafted in very unclear and quite generic way. And it's not, for example, certain what type of exact compensations which Ukraine may receive from Russia will fall into these proceeds. For example, it seems quite likely that any arbitration award which any Ukrainian company receives from Russian state or Russian state-owned company will not be considered as reparation proceeds. So by way of example, Naftogaz, which is the gas national company of Ukraine, received multiple arbitration awards against Gazprom, and some of them it's enforcing quite successfully. And it seems a better interpretation of the provisions of the loan agreement that this type of awards, if received by Naftogaz, will not be used for the purpose of repaying the loan, because they would not represent the reparations from Russia for war, but rather the results of a contractual dispute between two companies, even if they are stand-alone companies. So all in all, there is no end date for these repayments. It's highly unlikely that they will happen, at least in the foreseeable future, given that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and will certainly block any attempt by the UN Security Council to set up an arbitration tribunal or commission for the adjudication of these sort of claims. And it certainly will not volunteer the repayment of those claims. So given this background, it would be a fair assessment that it would be more appropriate to qualify this instrument from the legal perspective as an aid or a subsidy, rather than a fixed debt instrument carrying a fixed interest rate. So from that perspective, it's important to consider what are the conditions for this support. The conditions for the macroeconomic support are reforms in the Ukraine public finance sector, tax collection, and procurement sector. These are drafted in very generic way and are largely repetitive of those commitments which Ukraine took in connection with its accession to the European Union or IMF funding. There is nothing in substance here, which again, given that the country is at war, is quite understandable. It would be inappropriate to pull for the European Union to push for reforms at this stage, even if it specifically financed the budget deficit of Ukraine. What is less understandable are watered down provisions to support European industries in connection with this aid. Although there is a general provision that the European producers shall have a priority, these are substantially watered down by committing to allocate more than 35% of the proceeds of the loan. So we talk about 30 billion in total, and allocated for defense spending about 20 billion for third-party jurisdictions. And in case of urgency, meaning that the European producers cannot produce the relevant equipment, no restrictions apply. This is highly disfavorable for the European manufacturers, which legitimately should have expected that to the extent they provide this type of aid and financing, then at least it should be substantially used for the procurement of goods coming from the European Union, and the procurement of goods coming from the other countries shall be financed from other sources. I trust that you found this presentation useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you during my next presentation.